G'day there, you're watching the Aussie Vim Guru, and today I'm going to be covering the topic of worksharing and the management of central files that comes with that. So in the session we're going to cover a few things today. We're going to cover how to create a central file and also manage its worksets and set them up, how we can manage local files with that central model, synchronizing, saving, restoring, archiving and rewriting central files, all common topics that come up I find with my day-to-day interaction with Revit users. So we'll start with creating central files. So I guess what is a central model? So there's a common image here that most people have probably seen before from the Autodesk Knowledge Network that summarizes the principle of central work sharing, so that you have a central file on your server, and then locally on each machine you have a copy of that model which interacts with the central file in order for multiple people to access the single model at the same time. It's pretty much crucial to working in Revit with teams. Without it, you pretty much would have to work in a very convoluted and awkward manner, so fundamental. So it's really important to understand this process. I suggest you read up on it if you need to know more about it. So I'll just demonstrate, I guess, how to create a central model, because I find that this is something I get queried all the time in my work. So I've just got a demonstration project here that I've just set up on my desktop. It's just a copy of the Autodesk default project, so there's no hidden strings here. So to create a central file, we first need to enable the collaborate function in our model. It's going to ask us whether we want to collaborate in our network or on BIM 360 document management. BIM 360 is probably a session in itself, so I'll probably just focus on network for now, but if you have any questions about this, feel free to leave them down below. So most people are probably still collaborating on networks typically. So at this point, it's going to enable work sharing in the model. By default, it creates a couple of work sets. So everything in your model has basically moved onto what's called workset 1, and your levels and grids were moved onto shared levels and grids when that happened. At this point, we could create work sets. However, I'm just going to create a central file first instead, just to keep it easier. So at that point, we need to go save as project, and it'll prompt us to go to the same location. If you open up options, you'll see that now it's actually prompting you to make it a central model once you save. You pretty much don't have a choice now because worksets have been enabled, so this model is going to have to become a central file. Usually maximum number of save options for backups, I say 20 is probably a good number. You can go 100, 200, it just depends on how much size you want your backup folder to take up on your server. I think 20 is a good number though, and it's a realistic number of backups you would need to go back roughly. You can compact the file, which basically just makes the code a little bit more efficient. You can say which worksets do you want to be opened. So I'll run through this when I run through local files, but for now I'll just use specify, which is what I always recommend. And you can say what's your thumbnail preview of your model. Let's just make it our title sheet. You can regenerate the view each time someone synchronizes if it's not up to date. Sometimes it's better just to let it be what it was when you created the file. For now, I'll just leave that ticked off. So let's just add like a prefix to the file just so we can keep our original, but you could save over your original model here instead. So we'll just do a save, and this will now establish a central model. So this could be on a server, for example, rather than just on my desktop, but you can operate a central model from your desktop as well. It's just obviously a bit less practical to do so. You can, from this point, synchronize the work sets out, which would relinquish all permissions and ownerships that you might hold in this model. And it tells us that we successfully synchronized. So that's pretty much how you create a central file. So at that point, this is basically a central model, and you can see it starting to store its backups as well as a result. So that's in principle how that's done. We'll run through worksets now. So what are they? So I guess from the Autodesk Knowledge Network again, in principle, they're really just a layering or a management tool in order to group elements in the model. But there are some more functions that they carry out from a work sharing perspective. Things probably not necessarily worth knowing, but just that they are fundamental to how work sharing operates in Revit. So you don't have a choice but to use them. So you may as well take advantage of them. So why do we use them? So I guess we can get additional visibility and grouping that goes beyond categorization, filters, and groups. We can open groups of elements to work with, which means that our model session is a bit lighter, which is very relevant when you're working in a server-based environment, and that they facilitate work sharing. So I'll just demonstrate quickly how to establish worksets. Again, quite a basic demonstration. So I'm just going to open up a local file. I'll sort of run through this in more detail in a second, so don't worry too much about that process there. This is why I pick specify, because it says which worksets do you want to open, so you could manage out particular worksets of your model at that point. so that you're not opening up, say, every link on your project. So now we're in. So we're actually in a local file at the moment. I'll run through that in a second. But if we want to make Worksets, you just come to Worksets here, or Collaborate Worksets up here. So you can make new Worksets at this point. You can rename Worksets as well. I know some offices will rename their shared levels and grids Workset. This is okay. I wouldn't rename Workset 1. I'll cover that in a second. So if we make this editable, we become the owner of the Workset, and we can make it our Workset that's active if we want. So your active Workset is basically what everything you model will be associated to by default. So let's just say 00 shared levels and grids. Some people prefer to put like a number in front of a lot of their Worksets to force them to go in a particular order, because they will go alphabetically. So we'll just add a couple of Worksets, and as we add them, they basically just become Worksets in our model. I'm just going to add a few that will enable me to sort the elements in this model. I believe that's sufficient. You could also add, say, 99 or Z, something like that for links, and that could be a linked model. It's good to also think about default visibility, whether you want Worksets to be on by default when you're in a view. For now, let's just say we want our links to be off, and then we tell them to be on in our visibility graphic settings. So we don't want that to be an active Workset. It's usually good to make sure that your active Workset is something that makes sense. Otherwise, you might be modeling on the wrong Workset. So if I just go to 3D in this model, so you can see I've got a whole bunch of levels here. So if I isolate those, you'll see that they're already on shared levels and grids. Even though I've renamed the Workset, it's still the same Workset in principle. So what we can do now is just start to sort things onto particular Worksets. So we could say, oh, this isn't Workset 1, this is actually meant to be on site, because they're all trees. And what you can do to sort of make sure these are all being managed out is you can close all your Worksets except for the one that you're managing things off, and then go from there. So I can say, okay, topography. So you can also do a marquee selection and try to be a bit more creative with how you group things. But other than that, that's probably, I guess, something that you could keep doing from here. So you could take this and put it on facade, for example. I won't go all the way into detail with this because obviously it takes a lot of time and, you know, probably less productive than, you know, what else I could show you. But you can imagine by the time I've categorized all these onto particular Worksets, you can more or less control. So if I close all Worksets and say open just my site, you can see I'm just dealing with my site. So it's a bit of a layer management system. And obviously we've went across two categories here. We've got topography and planting. So you wouldn't be able to control those with one category in Revit, and you could control them with a filter, but it's not a very efficient way. So Worksets provide an alternative method to do so. So in principle, that's, I guess, how Worksets are set up. I'll just synchronize these in so that we can look at this after. Again, I'm about to run through synchronization, so don't worry too much about that. Okay, so my recommended Worksets. Everywhere that I've worked, it's different. But this is usually the recurring theme of which ones ended up being necessary or good to have. So I like architecture to contain most of the interior trades of the building, structure to contain any place-held structure that an engineer might be modeling, but where maybe we're modeling a copy to get more detail out of it or to set it out. Facade to cover all the surfaces of the facade of the building, including the roof and soffits. Site, which is outside the building but inside the site boundary, and context, which is outside the site boundary. I found that these are my crucial Worksets that I always end up needing. Obviously this one could be divided into more if you really wanted to, but I found that usually on its own it works because everything else is on a Revit category from there. Obviously if you have a really large model, you'll be looking at both model breakdown but maybe also Workset sub breakdown to more effectively control what you have open, but on a small project this would get the job done. From here you've got a bunch of what I call ancillary Worksets, which are levels and grids, reference planes and scope boxes. I always recommend these go on two Worksets that are off by default. That way you don't see reference planes and scope boxes in every single view that you create, and you don't have to constantly keep turning them off in visibility graphic settings for documentation views. That way they're just really there when you need them because they really reference elements, if anything. Some places I've worked at use what's called a hidden or a working Workset that's off by default, and it's almost like your sketch Workset. So everything you do on there is hidden by default. It's sometimes used for people if they're testing something out. But I find this can be a bad workflow because these elements still interact with elements on other Worksets. So you might have walls on a test option that are causing another wall to stop short in the real model. That could be an undesirable outcome on your documentation. So just be really careful with this workset. Use it very sparingly, if not at all. And links. I always recommend one model per workset. So make a workset for every single link. That way you can control them really quickly by turning them on or off as a workset, which will also load or unload the link. And if you have a set of DWGs, I wouldn't make one DWG per workset. That's just too many of them. But do like a set of drawings per workset. So if you have an RCP set from someone else, say a JV consultant that's not using Revit, make a workset for their RCPs so that they're on at least a set that you can control very quickly. And that will give you more control over your links. And workset 1, so that's that secondary workset that got created by default. Just leave it be. It behaves a bit like layer 0 or def points, as they call it in AutoCAD, so it contains a lot of critical data in the model that you can't get rid of. So you can't delete workset 1, but you can rename it technically, but I advise against renaming it because then you might forget which workset was workset 1 originally. So it holds on to the shared coordinates, nesting behaviors of families. So if you use this workset too much, or if you rename it and forget which one it is, you can find that your model might go corrupt later in the later stages, especially if it's a large project. I've seen this happen before. So just leave workset 1 alone. At the very most, I'd rename it to "Do not use this workset" or something that makes it obvious not to use it. So we'll go into creating local files now. So never open a central file directly from Explorer. That's really critical. So never double click and open your central file because unfortunately that will open your central file. It won't put you into a local file. So always through Revit as a local model. And what is a local file? So I guess back to the original diagram, a local file is your model that is talking to the central model, and there's multiple local files at the same time in principle. So I'll just demonstrate how to create one. So basically, every time I open a central model, I'll just quickly synchronize. I'll run through synchronize shortly, so don't worry about that. I'll just relinquish. Okay, so when I go to open a central model, you'll see down here there's this box called Create New Local File. There's Detach, which creates a separate model as a copy. There's Create New Local, which makes a local file. Audit will just do a small cleanup on the model to make it a bit smaller potentially. And here you can right click on this little arrow to say which workset option you want. Do I want to open all worksets, only the ones that are currently editable, the last ones that were viewed by the last person that synchronized, or specific worksets? In this case, I'm just going to say specific worksets. I'm going to go open. So you can either overwrite your current local, which is in your documents. So you can see here mine are being saved to my documents by default. I'll show you how to set that path up shortly. Or you can append a timestamp. And in principle, what that will do is that will give you two copies essentially. So I tell all my local files to go to a folder in my documents, and you can see all these here. So these specific projects here are basically what's happening with those. So they're being saved. They're being saved there. So you can see the original one there and the one with the timestamp. So it's got date and also time. So very specific. So you can't really have two copies of the same one. You may not want to overwrite your locals just in case you want to use them as a backup point. We're just going to close all worksets. Sometimes when you do close all worksets, it won't let you go in the model actually. Sometimes you need at least one workset open to enter central. Doesn't always happen, but it's an interesting behavior I've noticed. And once you're in, you'll see that your username is appended on the end of here, and that's because you're in that local file, you're not in the central model. But that file is essentially talking with the central file. If you got the file options, general, so your username is basically set here. If you're using Autodesk Online, this will typically be locked into your account name, and it's good to usually do that because you don't really want that username to change, because this becomes your identity when you're working in Revit models with teams. This is what people will know you as by name. That's how they recognize it's you. So from there, you're in a local file. So that's pretty much all there is to local files to understand. I'll just go to the next section, which I believe is synchronizing. So while you can technically open an old local file and reload latest instead of opening a fresh local file from central when you enter, I recommend it's usually safer and quicker to just make a new local file every time you re-enter the central model. So if you're going to lunch and you come back, I wouldn't open your local file, I just make a new fresh one. That way you're fully up to date and you don't run any risk of that local file having a reason why it can't communicate with central. which can occasionally happen. I recommend that you clean out your local files at least once per week. Don't let them build up on your My Documents or C Drive or wherever you're telling them to go, because they'll take up your local disk space and eventually they'll impact your performance. I've worked with users that have as much as 20 gigabytes of local files that have bloated their C Drive basically and stopped their computer from working as efficiently as it could, because they do basically hold, I think, the identical amount of model size as the central model. They're no lighter than the central model is, so this is about the same size as my central file. So just be aware of that. So we'll go through synchronizing. So when I do what I call synchronizing, I'm basically sending my changes back to the central model. I'm receiving the elements that I've changed, that have changed since I last synchronized and since other people synchronized. So these could be elements these people were working on that they sent back, and now I'm receiving those changes. And elements that I've checked out or I was working on, they're returned back to central for others to gain permission to edit again, so they become open for access. And then other users can then do the same process to receive my changes in turn. So it's important to note that elements aren't automatically updated in other people's local sessions after I synchronize. They need to synchronize as well, and they may also need to synchronize in order to work on elements that you've checked out but maybe didn't do anything to. It will usually tell them if they need to when they go to edit that element. They'll get an editing request, basically. And when I use what I call reload latest, I'm basically almost doing the same thing, but all I'm doing is receiving changes that other people have synchronized. I'm not returning any elements that I've worked on, and I'm not releasing them for other people to work on. Usually I only use this if I know I'm trying to see a change someone's made, but I still want to do some work on something that I don't want to return for someone else to work on yet. So I'll just quickly demonstrate how that process looks. So when you go up to Collaborate tab, Synchronize, usually I do Synchronize and Modify Settings. You can see it's pointing to the location of my central model. That's where it's going to synchronize back to. You can point to another file, but I wouldn't do that. There's usually not many workflows or reasons where you'd need to tell it to go somewhere else. And if you've checked out particular things here, such as worksets, so if I've made a new workset, I need to actually select to return that to the model. So if I just make a workset called 1, 2, 3, then I go to synchronize, you'll see I'm prompted to actually return this back because I've created it. So it's always good to clear these things out when you synchronize. Only compact if you're the last person to synchronize at the end of the day, because basically that will clean up the code of the model. And you can also put a description on what you're synchronizing, so or why you're synchronizing, which can be great. So let's just say I've done some work, and I don't know how to use good grammar either. So it's good to also save your local before and after you synchronize, just in case something happens, let's say the model crashes, so you've still got that local available to reopen if you need. So if I go that, so basically it's synchronizing now and it's receiving changes. Obviously I'm the only person in this model, so I won't be receiving many changes, if at all, and you'll get this message at the end that tells you that you're successful in your synchronization. So that's pretty much in principle what's happened, and the central model is now updated with my changes as well. And just be mindful, there's a tool called the Worksharing Monitor, which is great to use, and it basically tells you what's happening in your file while you synchronize and whilst other people are working. And it's good to avoid running into basically this dialogue that can happen. If you're trying to synchronize or do something while someone else is trying to synchronize, you'll basically cause a queue of people trying to do things, and it can really slow down the session and access for other people. So if you ever see this, always press cancel and just wait, and use the Worksharing Monitor to see why that warning could be coming up. Because you'll see here, this is basically the Worksharing Monitor, and it's telling me I'm working in local. If I go to synchronize again, you'll see that it actually tells me what's happening and what stages I'm going through. And this would also show for other people as well, so they'd see me synchronizing in that case. So just be mindful of that. Restoring and rolling back central models is quite rare, but it's still good to understand that it's possible. So if I just close my file, I'll just go back to the traditional ribbon. So whilst I'm not in a model, I still have a few tools available. So the one I'm going to use, first I'll show you show history. So if I select my work shared model and I open it from this dialog, you'll see it's going to tell me who's synchronized in this model. And because this is a template model, I can actually see everyone from the people that did work on this model from Autodesk, which is quite amusing. So these are actually other people that made changes to this file. I'm not sure who they are, but it's quite an amusing little thing. And then you can also see just where I've done all my synchronizers, what times, what they are, and you can obviously export that as a text report as well if you want to process it in Excel. And this is why putting comments is good, because now people can see why you synchronized. But I can also do restore backup. So I can go into the backup folder of that respective project, and it's going to prompt me to pick one of those slots that is available for backup. So let's just say we'll take this one. So you can either do save as or rollback. So rollback will actually go and update the central model. It's usually better to save as to another folder, review the file, and then you can make that a new central file instead. Rolling back isn't always the best because people might be in central, which could actually damage their access to the session. So just a good thing to be aware that it's possible to recover those particular sessions if you need to go back a few steps. But obviously, as well as that, be mindful that obviously most of us have IT departments that can get backups off servers as well, which is always another option. If you know the time you need the backup from and it's fallen out of the backup window of Revit, then that's another option if you have one. So one important element is how to archive and move central. So I usually recommend that you archive once a week is probably good if you're the model manager for your project. So to archive, open project. So click once, and before you open the model, do detach from central and open it this way. And it's going to give you a couple of prompts. It will say, what are your work sets? It's then going to prompt you if you want to retain work sets or get rid of work sets. So if you wanted to turn a work shared model into a non-work shared model, this is the tool to do it. But I've never come across a case where I'd want to do that because you'd lose all the functionality of work sets at that point. So I'm just going to do detach and preserve work sets. And essentially what this does is this creates a separate file that hasn't been saved yet. So if I go Control S, it'll prompt me to go and save this somewhere. And it's a detached model, it's a copy. So I'm not interacting with the central file at the moment. And you could have an archive folder from there with, the date, backup 1, and then you go. And it's up to you if you rename that file or if you just let it be the same name as the project. Completely up to you. And you can go on your options and you can just say 1 backup because it's just a backup, so who cares how many there are. And you save it. And at that point, you've basically created a new central file that's not being used but is there for backup purposes. You can copy and paste Revit models, but there are a few reasons why I recommend against it. So typically that's a much better workflow. The main reason is if someone else goes to try and access that backup, they'll get a lot of prompts that tell them they shouldn't be opening this model because it's not a central file with its right location because it hasn't been resaved properly. So that's quite important, and it's also a method of how you can move a central file as well whilst keeping that central functionality. Rewriting central, so this one's quite important, especially for BIM managers. It's usually something that we should do over time because Revit models do get bloated, they gain data. So the source code of a Revit model can gain unused or rogue data over time, which can unfortunately lead to data corruption, one of our least favorite things in Revit, where our models can potentially stop working or not let us in anymore. So it's really important. So ideally the workflow that we need to follow for this, which I'll show you as well, is that once a week, ideally right at the end of the week, so last person out of the model, tells the team to get out of the model, finish your work, synchronize it in, because I'm about to go and replace central, so you'll lose your connection if you don't save it in. From this point, you need to archive a copy of the model with the workflow that I've just shown you. And usually it's good to copy the respective backup folder into that same archive folder as well, so you have that available if you need to get a backup from the old sessions. From here, you need to open it up as a detached model, save as over the current central file, synchronize yourself out, close, and the model is essentially reopened for business. So very basically, that workflow would look something like this. So you detach. Usually it's good to do audit as well because it will reduce the amount of rogue data in that file. Close as many work sets as you can, detach and preserve. So we're basically in a detached model again at this point. So from here, we just want to go save as, project. This is after I've done an archive of the model. I actually was in the archive folder, let's say I wasn't. So you just go to options, backups 20. It remembered 1 because that's what I set the backups to for the archive version. You can change your workset default if you want. You can see because I'm detached, it's going to force me to compact and make it a central file. You can change the home screen, but otherwise you just get prompted to make sure that you want to save over and lose all your original backup versions. And yes, we do want to replace. And at this point, you become the owner of the worksets in the model because you're essentially in Central at this point. So if anything, you're basically like playing God with the Revit model. So if someone else was in this file, you could essentially synchronize out their changes if you were at this level, which is why we don't want to be in Central. And you can see that I own all the work sets. So I need to go to Collaborate, Synchronize with Central, and also synchronize those work sets out and do a compact. And at that point, it should synchronize the model, and then we relinquish, and then we leave because we're still in Central. And at that point, our work shared model is ready for business again. And usually the model size will get a little bit smaller if there was any size to be gained by reducing that size. So I'll just do a comparison. Obviously, this is a very small model, so I doubt there'd be a lot of file size to save. 16.8, yeah, so no file size saved there. So that's in summary pretty much how that process works. So that was pretty much the series. Lots of just basic workflows that I found people always ask me about. So hopefully that sort of helps you understand the process as well. And I'll probably do another session on BIM 360 at some point as well, just to show you how that alternative workflow can be used as well. So thanks for listening today. I hope you enjoyed it, and take care. I'll see you next time. Bye.